Brothers Chad Kopenski, Mike Miller, and Taylor Kleineick join me, David Daugherty, for the Ohio Lodge of Research to discuss the topic of nonfiction books that Masons should consider reading to further their education. What would you recommend as far as non-Masonic books go? Taylor, you want to go first?
Yeah, let me pull up my list because I did prepare.
We are limited to 20 to 30-minute segments, by the way.
I can spend 20 minutes on this. Um, so for Masons, right? To make sure I have the right question, what would you recommend to
Yeah,
other Masons? I
sure.
would say Moonwalking with Einstein. It is a book
Interesting.
about memorization and the memory palace technique, told from the perspective of a journalist who's trying to find the smartest person in the world, and he ends up finding these guys who are memorizing like all kinds of crazy stuff, like memorizing the order of like random decks of cards, as many as you can in a minute, right? Um, and it's a great way, one, to understand the memory palace and kind of that's connection to masonry. The book doesn't cover that, but there's a connection there. And actually learning ritual by kind of applying this technique is pretty useful. And plus, it's a great party trick. You can learn to memorize how to memorize the order of a deck of cards in like a minute. It's super easy. Um, I did that with another guy at work when I first read this book. It it's pretty fun. That one and How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Um, Freemasonry isn't necessarily giving us a actual history, right? The historical reality isn't really what matters. It's the symbolic and the myth, right? And How to Read Literature Like a Professor is a great way to understand how to think about things kind of in that context, and how to pull out information and do that well from books. Yeah, those are my two. I got four more if you want.
Go ahead, Mike. We'll come back to Taylor later.
So I kind of laugh because, not knowing what anybody else was going to pick, with the exception of what Chad told us he was going to do earlier, I also have a book on memory that was written by Middletown local Jerry Lucas, called The Memory Book. And it was also by Harry Lorraine. And it also has a lot of those memory techniques and stuff as well. And it's funny because I had just skimmed through again the memorization of deck of cards and stuff that's in this one as well. So it's kind of funny that we picked something similar but by different authors. And then I don't know if it was titled For the Mason or anything like that, but one of the things that I'm kind of into, and a lot of it stemmed off of survival shows and stuff like that off TV. I came across some different books that are put out there by Krieg Stewart. So you got, bug out vehicle, survival hacks, and a bug out bag type stuff. And then he even did one that was he made it relatable to the Hunger Games. Sorry, the backwards camera on there. So those are some of the things that I'm kind of into. It's a little bit of a self-improvement type stuff, but all good reads.
Nice. Chad, what are yours?
Oh, do you have this, Mike?
I do not.
This is the 1986 Department of the Army Survival Guide.
Nice.
Okay. I don't know when we see you next. Grand Lodge. Okay, I'll bring it with me. First off, I want to say this. I think I'm the only one of you guys that doesn't have a bookshelf behind me, and this bothers me that I'm not that pretentious or affected. So for me, it's this book. I think this is the book that every Mason should read. Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyers. It's going to ruin every single book you ever read ever. His whole idea of what he lays out in here is essentially his idea of the monomyth, that there is this heroic cycle, having to deal with growth. Like it is going from earthly to mystical and back, from disconnection, connection and back. And that he noticed this story in all these world religions and all these world cultures. And so he realized that there must be this way of talking about the human experience. And so as you look at this heroic cycle, this mono myth, you realize that, yeah, there is something about the human experience that all these cultures are trying to talk about. And so, I mean, to me, this helped me understand ritual. This helps me understand a lot of sort of, why we do what we do. And it's sort of, in my mind, if you're going to be a ritualist, if you're going to be a Freemason, at some point, you need to just read this book to understand, to give you a framework to understand everything else. And then memorization, I don't know. It's weird to me that you both chose something about that. Do you guys struggle with memorization or no?
I do.
More with reciting it, if that makes sense. Okay, I lose my
You
train
have
of
it in your
thought.
brain, but you can't get it out of your head.
Yep.
That's interesting. Okay. Dave, what was yours?
So I have 3 in front of me, and it was a struggle to narrow it down to that. Kind of like Taylor, I probably could have spent the next 20 minutes, listing off books, but I think I took a slightly different perspective than the 3 of you did. The first one that I pulled, so maybe preface it with this. I find it interesting that no matter what I read, I end up with a Masonic connection. And I think some of that comes back to, there's a quote Mackey had, I think, about, Masons that read or something like that. And, it's just that, the more information you gather, the more connections you make. But one of the books that I chose was The Pleasure of Finding Things. I should say The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, Richard Feynman. He is one of my personal heroes. I could spend probably the next 30 minutes just talking about him. There's actually a couple other books that he wrote that, What Do You Care What Other People Think? And Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, are good ones. But these are all short essays, just things that he wrote. And I thought it was interesting because I forget which one of you, but earlier in our conversation, somebody mentioned about uncertainty. And when I pulled this book off of my shelf, I rarely leave tags or bookmarks in my books. But when I pulled this book off the shelf, there was a Post-it note on a page, and the essay that it was marking was titled "The Attitude of Uncertainty." So I thought it was interesting, the connection there. But again, not a Mason, not about Masonry, but I think that title alone, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, kind of fits with what we do. The other one I pulled off was Alfred North Whitehead. I happened to pull Modes of Thought, but there's a handful of books that he wrote. Any one of them would have been appropriate. For those of you that are anybody that's not familiar with him, Whitehead was an educational philosopher from the 1920s. And I just find most everything that I read of his rings true for me, as well as for that Masonic connection. And then the last one that I chose actually falls under the fiction category, but I honestly think of it more of a philosophy book than a fiction. I'm curious if anybody else has read it. It is Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a fictional story because it's about a talking ape. But it's a very clever mnemonic to describe some of the current, modern philosophies of life, if you will. And I just think that was I think the information that's in it is compelling, but I think the way that the story is told is even more compelling. And then there were 2 sequels to it. My favorite of the sequels is the second one was called My Ishmael. And the premise of the book is this talking ape who basically knows all of the answers to the universe takes on these students. And one of the complaints, as I understand it, of the initial book is that it was too difficult for many people to understand, to follow. So the sequel is called My Ishmael, and his student, the ape's student, is a 12-year-old girl. So it's basically he's explaining the world to a 12-year-old girl. And I just thought that was such a fascinating way to tell the story. But again, none of those are by any means Masonic, but I think that, there's something there. There's a lesson to be learned from all of them.
But that's the interesting thing about all these books is like, I'm on my Aldo Leopold kick, right? Or, John Rourke, Robert Rourke, Old Man and the Boy, which is about kind of getting back to nature. I mean, all of us have to kind of figure out a way that Masonry works, and then kind of figure out a way that Masonry works for us. And so you're saying that you see all these things that are Masonic. I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Is to make those connections, to say, like, I don't know, Power of Myth, but I can also think of, Letters to a Poet by, what's his name? Rainier Rilke, or, a Dashiell Hammond book. Like anything can be Masonic given the right framework, if it helps you understand things a little bit better, right?
Yeah. And it just as a side note, Chad, so I think all of I've told you before that, one of my, my favorite way to end the day is to build a fire in my fire pit on our back patio and sit there with a book and perhaps a beverage. And anyway, a couple nights ago, I was doing that, and my wife came out and joined me. And I don't know why I did it, but for some reason I pulled up on my phone, Think Like a Mountain, because it's a very, very short read. And this is not something we do on a regular basis, but, or at all for that matter. But for some reason I chose to do it that night. And I, pulled that up on my phone and I read it out loud, and it sparked this conversation. And it was just fascinating because, it's just, especially sitting outside, listening to the crickets and the frogs and everything else that's going on into the, into fall. And it was just it was an interesting conversation to start. So I think that's part of the fascination.
You see why I like that piece?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the fascination of reading in general, is that, as we've all four already said, it's that constant accumulation of new information that we can share and build new connections with ourselves and with other people.
For the listeners at home, Think Like a Mountain, an essay by Aldo Leopold. It'll take you 10 minutes to read it?
Oh, if that, yeah.
But it's a neat take. So
yeah. Taylor, the rest of us didn't adhere to the 2-book limit. So what were the other ones on your list that you were thinking about? Not that we had an actual 2-book limit. We just imposed that on you to get you to stop talking.
That's a good choice. So I picked books that I thought would be useful for other Masons to understand Masonry. So they're all kind of like grouped together in some way. Like the other two were understanding symbolism. One was, how to actually perform ritual. There's a book called Culture Code, another book called Tribe. And I think these books are very useful for understanding the social aspects of lodge and how to build lodge culture and a kind of a cohesive group of people and get them to work together. And both these books have really good kind of content. And actually, Culture Code is actually written by a guy who lives in Cleveland, who I was thinking about trying to get him to come down to, a lodge research event and give a presentation on it. But they're good books for understanding, our social dynamics in the lodge. And understanding that, sometimes the dysfunctions that we have and things that we're doing are directly responsible for the struggles we find in our lodges. That, our behavior, the things that we are doing or not doing, the things that are, other people are doing, directly impact kind of what we do there.
It's interesting that you mentioned those books. The other books that people tend to mention like that are anything by, Saranac, like Leaders Eat Last, or How to Win Friends and Influence People, like all those, Who Moved My Cheese, all those books on leadership that were big in the corporate world. tend to get recommended as well for the same reason. I think, Taylor, just trying to understand how a complex system within a lodge works. So.
Well, that's the thing, is that a lot of business books are really trying to get after what we already have in lodge. So I think it's really interesting that sometimes lodges are trying to adopt business behavior when businesses are trying to adopt, good lodge practices. Suscheck's entire liberating structures things are, some of them are things that we do kind of naturally in lodges when you kind of look into some of what they're doing. It's my opinion that, from the 1980s to now, the adoption of some of these business practices that haven't been proven in the long term, or that create problems in the long term, drives some of the reasons that we find ourselves in hard positions now. The other two books I had were actually related to complex dynamic systems, kind of indirectly. One is called Linked, by a Italian professor whose name I can't pronounce. It's about networks and how networks kind of function. And the other one is Thinking in Systems, which is about how to understand kind of systems thinking, how things are kind of connected together. You have reserves and feedback loops and all this stuff. In that book, she talks about in Thinking Systems, she talks about different types of systems that you can see. So you can kind of see systems that regulate themselves down, right, in a kind of death spiral. We see some lodges doing that. That the feedback kind of loops down, and hear about that vicious cycle all the time. Others that are very static, or what we get some called policy resistance, where people fight really, really hard to keep the status quo, right? If I'm trying to pull the lodge in one direction, Mike's trying to pull in another, and Chad's trying to pull in a third direction. Basically, the lodge just stays exactly where it's at. Everybody's basically fighting, and the lodge doesn't go anywhere. I think we see that a lot in a lot of lodges that have different visions for what people want to do. And that one way to deal with this is to kind of expand the system, create new lodges, spin the lodges off, so people aren't fighting over some of these things. And Linked is just kind of general networks, and very similar to that idea that, these are systems that have connections. You have the, small world phenomenon where, and one of the things is the power of weak ties, so that, I might not know somebody from Jefferson very well, but if I ran out to them in, well, actually, we'll give you historical analysis. So the Better Angels of Our Nature is a whole set of stories about the power of weak ties in Freemasonry directly, that, these people who didn't know these people, from anybody else besides a handshake, these Masons go out of their way to save each other, either stop fighting in the middle of a battle to bury somebody on, basically on the grounds of a handshake, to giving somebody food that could get you charged with treason. So the power of those weak ties is really one of the things that really drives that legendary nature of what we do as a fraternity.
Like I say, it all comes down to connections.
Yep.
It's interesting, Dave, at MCME, I had Beasley lead a session about the 3 books every Mason should read. It was done kind of like bookmarks. The idea being that, if you're a beginning Mason, if you're a lodge education officer, you could cut this off and give it to somebody and say, okay, here's some books you should read. So for getting Mason, he went some of those books you mentioned. When you mentioned the Originalist Mason, Mason's Words, Crafted Lodge, and the Craft, my favorite, The Empty Space, which is about theater, and Gems of Masonry by Shearer, just because it's doing things. For Historical Mason, he mentioned Better Angels of Our Nature, Taylor, and I keep saying he, but he actually led these sessions where brethren were divided up and said, well, there are these kind of Masons. These are the books. If this is the guy's interest that he should start with. So yeah, Mission Brotherhood, Masons, Better Angels of Our Nature. For the weekend Mason, some of the shorter reads. I like Meditations. I like this book, How to Be Perfect, the Correct Answer to Every Moral Question, by Schur. That's the guy who did the Good Place, that TV show. It's actually a pretty good book. Leadership, Krenko's book, the Kleineick book. I'm surprised none of you went esoteric and did like Chuck Dunning, or I suppose I did Power of Myth, but uh, if anyone's interested in kind of meditation and that kind of aspect, you can't go wrong with Chuck Dunning. Like this Contemplative Masonry is a phenomenal book.
Yeah,
And
we
then
we
they did,
specifically
the
stayed we
Masons.
specifically stayed away from Masonic books, though. So that kind of kept us out of the esoteric
that's
world,
right.
I think.
But for the Mason's son, Little Prince, I'm surprised none of you brought that book up. That's probably the most Masonic, non-Masonic book out there.
I've never read that one.
What?
Never read that one.
You've never read Little Prince?
Mm-mm.
Big going to Grand Lodge?
Yeah.
I'll add it to the pile.
Okay.
Yeah, Meditations by Aurelius, and then different podcasts. And so I don't know, I always thought it's interesting that you got to pick none of the books that were on there, except for just a few,
Yeah.
which was great. But yeah,
I was going to say, ironically, I was in Beasley's course when he did that, and none of those are one of the ones that I picked out.
it had to be
Well, let me
edited.
ask a different question that none of you prepared for. Is there a book that you would recommend that a Mason not read? Masonic or otherwise?
Morals
That's a
and
good
Dogma.
question.
Morals and Dogma, Chad?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fine book. And Pike and Mackey, they're both great guys, and it just is. How we talked about, there's certain books that you kind of need a little bit of context and distance to really appreciate. It seems to be that that's one of those books they give guys the night that they're raised, and like that's the last book you want to read the night that you're raised. Just there's other things you want to do first. So
it's interesting you say that, because the copy of Morals and Dogma that I own was the copy that was given to my grandfather the day he was raised.
Did he ever open it?
I have no idea. Probably not. Based on the look of it, no, I don't think it was read much. I've read it a little bit, but but like I said, to me, that's more of the connection is more important. The fact that it was his book.
Right.
For those of you that are curious, I think the Southern jurisdiction does. I have to look up the link, but there is an audio version of Morals and Dogma that you can listen to. It's like 56 hours or something like that, but you're welcome to listen to it. Mike, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to suggest the same thing. Morals and Dogmas, it's a little overwhelming for someone who's just getting going. There's definitely a lot to it.
I don't know. I've never not recommended a book. Maybe just because you mentioned him earlier, but some of John Nagy's stuff, I'm very hesitant to recommend to people.
Agreed.
Specifically because of the Mason versus Freemason argument that he makes. I think it's one of the most detrimental arguments out there currently for the fraternity. That there are some brothers who are actual brothers and others are not. And I just think it's one of the, I think it sets up some of the most, it does create disharmony in a way that I think prevents a Mason from developing. If you go back to that esoteric idea that it creates a sense of superiority that just isn't appropriate for a Mason to adopt, and just runs counter to a lot of the stuff that we talk about. But he also has some good stuff in there too.
I know. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I've met him. He's charming. He's delightful. He's a great speaker. But I think one of the things that, I think we've all kind of been saying today is that anything you read, it's okay to question it. And it's okay that sometimes there's gold coins in that pile of poo, but sometimes you gotta do a little mining. The reason why I asked earlier if there was a book that ever made you mad, I went to a Jesuit school for college, and they intentionally made me read books that they knew would piss me off, but then they made me write about why it pissed me off. And that was the whole point, was to get you to think and to critique and to be able to say, no, not that, this, and this is why. And so, Coach Nagy is a great guy. And I mean, go ahead and read his books, but also understand it's okay to say, yeah, not that. Like you just said, Taylor, this, but not this. And here's why. So.
Well, let me ask one last question, maybe to end this conversation, maybe not end, but to bring this conversation to a close for the day, which is there a book, Masonic or otherwise, that you don't think others are familiar with that you think they should absolutely read?
For what purpose?
Whatever purpose you want them to have.
This guy, The Lodge and the Craft by Roland Blackmer. Love this book. I think it's really great. People read it, but people don't really talk about it a lot. Highly recommend it.
How old is that thing?
Mine?
No, how old is that book? I forget when that was written.
1976.
Yeah, I was like, I know I've read it, but it's been like, it's a chestnut at this point. Why do you like it?
I think he gets the system of Freemasonry as a whole. I think he gets it right. Sometimes some of the esoteric guys either bring in outside sources, or they downplay critical aspects of the fraternity. Right? Sometimes they make fun of the fork and knife Masons. But I think Blackmore really, in this book in particular, he gets kind of all of it, right? The book kind of gets it's a good smattering of all the various aspects of fraternity. It's presented in a cohesive way where the importance of each one of these things and how they interact with each other, you kind of see that in this book. Where sometimes some of the other esoteric stuff, or the non-esoteric stuff or the historical stuff, it doesn't really capture the system of Freemasonry as a whole. I think that this book does a great job of that.
It's interesting.
Mike, did you have a book in mind?
Most of what I've read, honestly, has already been as mainstream. The only one that I've just really recently started, and I'm literally like a chapter in, is the Origins of Masonry. To say that I recommend it though at this point is premature.
I said you have to kind of figure out that book that kind of gives you you're in. I've been going on this sort of like man and nature kick, or man's relationship to nature, which is why I've gone to Aldo Leopold and Robert Rourke and bits of Walden. I also think any kind of book which helps you kind of understand the process of thinking. I've joked that if I ever were to get a degree again, the book that I would love to use would be Ed Parker's Infinite Insights into Kenpo Karate, Volume 5, which is mental and physical, stimulation. Because in it, he talks about how he analyzed his own work as a martial artist and ended up abstracting beyond that to something what in American Kenpo is called the universal pattern, which is this really beautiful, it looks like a flower. It is a graphic representation of a meditation of all the possible moves a human body can make. And so he talks about how he developed it. Then he talks about its application, and reading it is just, it was one of the last books I've read where I had to stop every 3 pages and just kind of go somewhere for like 45 minutes and just think about it. Because so any of those books, I think, whether it is, Marcus Aurelius or, Aquinas, or like anything that kind of helps you see the world through somebody else's eyes and understand their thinking, I think is a phenomenal book.
Chad, have you read Silent Spring? Rachel Carson?
Oh, that sounds familiar.
It was kind of the first book that kind of falls under that environmentalist category.
Yeah, hold on. I know that
But
book.
anyway, with your current kick, I thought you might that might be something on your radar.
Silent Spring. Maybe I haven't.
Silent Spring. Carson is the author's name.
Oh, I know she was part of, like, wasn't she big with the NRDC? Wasn't that her whole big thing?
I think so. Yeah, I think we're talking
Okay.
the same person. Yeah, yeah. When somebody asks me, especially somebody new to the lodge or whatever, that says, is there something I should look at? The one that I have been recently throwing towards people is actually John Bizak's book, Taking Issue. It's more a collection of a number of different papers he's written. And there's one article in there alone that caught my attention more than anything else. One, because I'm a Green Bay Packers fan and, the Wisconsin connection, but it goes back to Vince Lombardi's speech that he gives. And I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to get the wording wrong, but it was something like, boys, this is a football. And the point of it is even though he was coaching professional football, he literally went back to the fundamentals of, this is a football. This is how we use it in order to play this game. And it stresses the importance of knowing the fundamentals of anything you're going to do and use. And there's other articles in there, but that was the one article in that book that really got my attention among others. And admittedly, it was probably the Lombardi connection more than anything else. But like I said, is that the greatest book on Masonry? No, I mean, no offense to Brother Bizak, but it's a good book. It's got a lot of good articles in it, but I don't think I could tell you what is the best book on Masonry. But it's one that I think that it's got enough different ideas in it that you'll find something that strikes a chord with you. Any other last minute thoughts or ideas as far as books, fiction or nonfiction, or reading in general, that anybody wants to share with the world?
What is it, like a knife needs iron, a mind needs books?